Darwin's Theory. On December 1831, the British ship HMS Beagle set sail from England on a 5-year trip around the world. On board was a 22-year-old named Charles Darwin. Darwin eventually became the ship's naturalist, a person who studies the natural world. His job was to learn as much as he could about the living things he saw on the voyage. Darwin observed plants and animals he had never seen before. He wondered why they were so different from those in England. Darwin's observations led him to develop one of the most important scientific theories of all time, the theory of evolution by natural selection. Darwin's observations. As you can see in Figure 1, the Beagle made many stops along the coast of South America. From there, the ship traveled to the Galapagos Islands. Darwin observed living things as he traveled. He thought about relationships among these organisms. Darwin's important observations included the diversity of organisms, the remains of ancient organisms, and the characteristics of organisms on the Galapagos Islands. Darwin was amazed by the tremendous diversity of living things he saw. In Brazil, he saw insects that looked like flowers and ants that marched across the forest floor like huge armies. In Argentina, he saw sloths, animals that moved very slowly and spent much of their time hanging in trees. Today, scientists know that organisms are even more diverse than Darwin could ever have imagined. Scientists have identified more than 1.7 million species of organisms on Earth. A species is a group of similar organisms that can mate with each other and produce fertile offspring. Fossils. Darwin saw fossils of animals that had died long ago. A fossil is the preserved remains or traces of an organism that lived in the past. Darwin was puzzled by some of the fossils he observed. For example, he saw fossil bones that resembled the bones of living sloths. The fossil bones are much larger than those of the sloths that were alive in Darwin's time. He wondered what had happened to the giant creatures from the past. In 1835, the Beagle reached the Galapagos Islands. Darwin observed many unusual life forms on these small islands, such as the giant tortoises or land turtles. Some of these tortoises could look him in the eye. After returning to England, Darwin thought about the organisms he had seen. He compared the Galapagos organisms to organisms that lived elsewhere. He also compared organisms on different islands in the Galapagos group. He was surprised by some of the similarities and differences he saw. Darwin found many similarities between Galapagos organisms and those in South America. Many of the birds on the islands, including hawks, mockingbirds, and finches, resembled those of the mainland. Many of the plants were similar to plants Darwin had collected on the mainland. However, there were important differences between the organisms on the islands and those on the mainland. The iguanas on the Galapagos Islands had large claws that allowed them to grip slippery rocks, where they fed on seaweed. The iguanas on the mainland had smaller claws. Smaller claws allowed the mainland iguanas to climb trees, where they ate leaves. You can see the differences in Figure 2. So here we have a land iguana, and a Galapagos marine iguana. From his observations, Darwin hypothesized that a small number of different plants and animal species had come to the Galapagos Islands from the mainland. They might have been blown out to sea during a storm or set adrift on a fallen log. Once the plants and animals reached the islands, they reproduced. Eventually, their offspring became different from their mainland relatives. As he traveled from one Galapagos island to the next, Darwin also noticed many differences among organisms. For example, the tortoises on one island had dome-shaped shells. Those on another island had saddle-shaped shells. A government official on the islands told Darwin that he could tell which island the tortoise came from just by looking at its shell. Like the tortoises, the finches on the Galapagos were noticeably different from one island to the next. The most obvious differences were the varied sizes and shapes of the birds' beaks, as shown in Figure 3. An examination of the different finches showed that each species was well suited to the life it led. Finches that ate insects had narrow, needle-like beaks. Finches that ate seeds had strong, wide beaks. Beak shape is an example of an adaptation, a trait that helps an organism survive and reproduce in its environment. The finch's beak structures help in obtaining food. Other adaptations help organisms avoid being eaten. For example, some plants, such as the milkweed, are poisonous or have bad taste. A variety of adaptations aid in reproduction. The bright colors of some flowers attract insects. When an insect lands on the flower, the insect may pick up pollen grains, which produce sperm. The insect then may carry the pollen grains to another flower, enabling fertilization to take place. After he returned to England, Darwin continued to think about the diversity of species he had seen during his voyage. Darwin spent the next 20 years consulting with other scientists, gathering more information and thinking through his ideas. Darwin's reasoning. Darwin especially wanted to understand the different adaptations of organisms in the Galapagos Islands. Darwin reasoned that plants or animals that arrived in the Galapagos Islands faced environmental factors that were different from those of the mainland. Perhaps Darwin hypothesized the species gradually changed over many generations, became better adapted to the new environment. The gradual change in a species over time is called evolution. Darwin's ideas are often referred to as a theory of evolution. A scientific theory is a well-tested concept that explains a wide range of observations. From the evidence he collected, Darwin concluded that organisms on the Galapagos Islands had changed over time. However, Darwin did not know how the changes had happened. Darwin studied other examples of changes in living things to help him understand how evolution might occur. One example of Darwin's study was the offspring of animals produced by selective breeding. English farmers in Darwin's time used selective breeding to produce sheep with fine wool. Pigeon breeders had produced pigeons with 2 or 3 times the usual number of tail feathers. The pigeon breeders did this by repeatedly allowing only those pigeons with many tail feathers to mate. Darwin thought that a process similar to selective breeding might happen in nature, but he wondered what process selected certain traits. In 1859, Darwin published a book called On the Origin of Species by Natural Selection. In it, Darwin proposed that evolution occurs in nature through a mechanism he called natural selection. In natural selection, individuals that are better adapted to their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce than other members of the same species. Darwin identified factors that affect the process of natural selection: overproduction, variations, and competition. Figures 5 and 6 show how natural selection might happen in a group of turtles. Right? So we have overproduction. Turtles lay many eggs, not all of the young will survive. Variation. Each turtle has slightly different traits. For example, some turtles can move faster than others. Right? Competition. Turtles may compete with one another. A faster turtle may escape from a predator. In selection, variations such as speed make some turtles better able to survive their environment. Darwin overproduction. So Darwin had essayed the principle of population by an Englishman named Thomas Robert Malthus. Malthus argued that humans and other organisms tend to produce a lot of offspring. Malthus pointed out that sometimes the food supply is not large enough to feed all of these offspring. Darwin knew that, in addition to food, living things need other resources such as water and living space. He also knew that overproduction occurs in many species. Many female insects, for example, lay thousands of eggs. If all the newly hatched insects survived, they would soon crowd out all other plants and animals. Darwin knew this doesn't happen. But why not? Variations. As you learn in genetics, members of species differ from one another in many of their traits. The difference between individuals of the same species is called a genetic variation. For example, certain insects may be able to eat foods that other insects of the species avoid. This characteristic gives the insects an advantage over most insects in their species. Competition. Since food and other resources are limited, the members of a species must compete with each other to survive. Competition does not always involve direct physical fights between members of a species. Instead, competition is usually indirect. For example, many insects do not find enough to eat. Others are caught by predators. Only a few insects will survive. Selection. Darwin observed that variations make individuals better adapted to their environment. These individuals are more likely to survive and to reproduce. Their offspring may inherit the helpful characteristic. The offspring in turn will be more likely to survive and reproduce, and thus pass on the characteristic to their offspring. After many generations, more members of the species will have the helpful characteristic. In effect, the environment has selected organisms with helpful traits to become parents of the next generation. Darwin proposed that over a long time, natural selection can lead to change. Helpful variations may gradually accumulate in a species, while unfavorable ones may disappear. Factors in the environment can affect an organism's ability to survive. Environmental factors can therefore lead to selection. For example, monkey flowers are a type of plant. Most monkey flowers cannot grow in soil that has high concentration of copper. However, because of genetic variation, some varieties of monkey flower now grow near copper mines in spite of the copper in the soil. Here is how natural selection might have resulted in monkey flowers that grow in copper-contaminated soil. When the soil around a mine first becomes contaminated, a small number of monkey flowers may have been able to survive with a high level of copper. These plants grew and reproduced. After many generations, most of the seeds that sprouted in the soil produced monkey flowers that could withstand the copper. Genes and natural selection. Like environmental factors, genetic variation contributes to evolution. Without variations, all members of a species would have the same traits. Natural selection would not occur because all individuals will have an equal chance of surviving and reproducing. Darwin could not explain what caused variations or how they were passed on. As scientists learned later, variations can result from mutation or the shuffling of alleles during meiosis. Genes are passed from parent to offspring, and because of this, only traits that are inherited or controlled by genes can be acted upon by natural selection.